I am a gardener. As someone who has spent some 25 years in my garden, I have come to realize that the earth itself is a garden, and that we need all the help we can get caring for it. So I decided to leave my garden for a while and set out to see if I could find some folks who could help us.
Nature is all around us. It's what sustains us all. It's really the source of all life, of our inspiration. It really is the world that guides and nourishes us. Nature is literally, inherently, what we depend on.
Southern Red Oak was a place where we met. I remember this tangle of sparkleberry that had rabbit-like paths through it. The place we all kind of respected and revered was there's this wonderful bowl. A pack of rowdy boys who had reverence for nothing, but we kind of come over the ridge and into this thing and see that kind of the absinthe glow of the light from these beech leaves and coming in there, and we just felt a sense of hush.
When we grew up, the parents just opened the door and said, "Be back in time for dinner." We went out and we played in the woods. We played in the natural areas. There was plenty of nature near where we lived, and we developed a relationship with nature that a lot of kids nowadays just don't have.
I spent my whole childhood growing up on an orchard from the age of 10 or so, working with my father, pruning and working in the apple, peach, and pear trees. Another part of it, which seems to come out of another century, is that there was an old hermit named Bill Andrus who had been married once for a week, and he couldn't quite see his way through to a second week, so he moved to a barn. You know, he grew 95% of what he ate. And every week or two, my brother John and I would go to visit him. And he would show us what he was growing. He'd take us into the woods and show us where squirrels had built nests up in the trees. The line between pure nature and Bill Andrus was very unclear.
When I remember my early memories of growing up on Goodfellow Road, and we'd go up to the top of the hill, and the Goodfellows lived up there, Tom and his sister Etta. It was just a way of living that was so connected to nature and to the earth. In fact, they grew all their vegetables. They had the outhouse. They didn't have any running water, and they tapped the maple trees. They were constantly using nature's bounty for their life, and most of us would get nature's bounty from the store, and yet they got it from the land. I remember Tom walking those hills. Every time I went up there, I'd see him walking. He'd be walking these fields, and he always had projects that I'm sure he knew what they were, what he was doing, but he knew every inch of that land, like the back of his hand. I think of Tom Goodfellow as very grounded, very, very connected to every detail of everything that happened on his land. And I think about him because I really, in a way, envy that connection to the everyday life with the natural world, and most of us are pretty disconnected. People like Tom Goodfellow and Bill Andrus really open a door into a timeless way of living that I really think we yearn for.
We've always sent our children to school for an intellectual education. And connecting to nature has been disconnected from that intellectual process. So that if young people aren't getting this relationship building skill set at home, either with their parents or at camp or through a neighbor, they're not going to get it at school. When one parent was at home, it was easier to turn the kids loose outside. And maybe it was as simple as the backyard or a brook at the end of the road or even just a wooded lot. Children are primarily now having structured experiences inside.
I've been teaching 36 years at the University of Delaware. I've seen a lot of classes come and go. And looking over that time span, I can say that the ecological IQ of incoming students is getting lower and lower and lower, because they've grown up in a world where they've had no exposure to nature. They've had very little opportunity to go out and teach themselves. We have not focused in our educational system, even at the higher level colleges, on what we call the taxonomies. You know, what is this plant? What is this insect? What is this snake? So now we're turning out college students who know nothing about the animals they're supposedly studying. They don't know the natural history. And of course, that's what generates the interesting questions.
You know what's not taught in college anymore? Botany. That used to be a very important piece of a humanitarian education, that you know trees, you know how trees work, you know what their names are, you know what plants work with other plants. Nobody knows that. They barely know basic trees that are around them. I think most people don't. Botany should be taught to fourth graders.
Today's cultures all over the world really are almost totally disconnected from the natural world. We've created these artificial systems. People think that they get their food from the store, they get their water from the tap. So as we develop more and more and more, we're destroying those aspects of the world, and it's a huge problem, and very few people appreciate that.
There are a lot of different consequences of humans sort of disconnect from the importance of a healthy environment in our lives. Those people who grow up to have a passion for the earth were those that had meaningful experiences outdoors when they were children.
Today, we're facing the electronic revolution. Our kids are spending enormous amounts of time looking at their phones, texting, Facebooking, all the things that they do. It requires electricity. They're not doing that outside. So they are very well informed electronically, but that has become a huge barrier. There are no plugs outside. You can't recharge. The thing that is interesting to them, the video games, all the things, it's always presented electronically. The inherent interest that I think kids are born with is eroded away.
In a lot of senses, in the last 50 years or so, we have broken with nature. We felt like it was our right to do so, and the attitude is, you know, nature's for us to do with what we want and exploit what we want. And now I think there's a great sense of what they've lost from not being connected to nature. The fact that you can live with nature or against it are two different dichotomies that we have to settle on and sort of reconfigure before it's all lost.
One of the things that just puzzles me is, again, how rapidly humans have gotten so isolated with everything that supports us. Certainly the impact of technology, certainly a trend toward urbanization. We're sort of in a crisis of our own soul.
It's important that we're connected to nature because nature is what keeps us alive on this planet. A lot of people think that nature is nice, we can visit it, it's pretty, but we don't really need it. If it disappears, we can watch it on Channel 12 and it'll be okay. That is so far from the truth, it's actually a little scary. So nature is absolutely essential. We are part of it. We're products of nature. We can't exist in isolation of nature.
Nature deficit disorder is a term coined by my friend and colleague, Richard Louv. It's really a description of changes in society. It's a change in, again, human relationships to the natural world, where people literally do not have much experience outdoors in any number of ways with nature as an integral or a healthy part of their everyday lives. So deficit means we're without it. We're without nature. We're without an appreciation of nature's role, the many benefits that come to us.
There's a huge effort to reconnect children with nature. I would like to expand that, reconnect their parents as well. The only reason the children are disconnected is because the parents don't see the value in it. Kids are the future stewards of the planet. If they don't realize stewardship of nature is important, they're going to be lousy stewards. So they're copying us. Right now, we're not very good stewards. We need to be better role models.
I think worse yet, and I think what's most disturbing for me, is that I think there's a rising level of fear of the natural world.
Children don't play outdoors very much. People are afraid to let them go on their own to explore the woods or a park or something like that.
The news we get about nature is often negative. We've demonized it. It's a dangerous place, and we better not go outside, or something's going to eat us or kill us. The positives of being in nature far outweigh the negatives, and we don't hear much about that.
We live in a post-wild world. The world I live in is very different than the environment I grew up in. My son's experience of nature and wild is very different than mine was. I mean, I had a suburban home that bordered this just huge, immense forest. Now, when I want to explain to my 4-year-old, what happens with a monarch butterfly or what happens something in nature, we go to YouTube.
I think we're fragmented in so many ways, and I think we are separated and fragmented from nature, from each other, from our families. I think we're very cut off. And fear is a big part of that. There's a lot in our culture that creates and supports a fear of nature. Heaven forbid. You should have a piece of that in yourself.
There's a phrase that was coined by a scholar by the name of Peter Kahn, and he worries about what he calls environmental generational amnesia. If a child sees something like a polluted stream or a degraded environment with very little biodiversity and thinks that's what it is and will always be, having never had the memory of what it was before, then we're creating a situation where children don't know that there is a richness that's at risk.
How do you tell someone they need what they don't know? I mean, let's say they've really grown up in an inner city with, the only nature they see is in movies. I think it's very hard to be a human being without some connection to nature. I see it as a source. And I'm careful when I say that because there's another generation coming up that doesn't have access to this. I'm conscious that, they have to get their sense of humanity in other places.
So it's not about whether we can or can't have a relationship. It's much more an issue of, do we understand who and what we really are, or are we going to try and ignore it or avoid the responsibility that comes with being a part of nature? Nature is an idea. Nature is not reality. Nature is an idea that helps society do what it wants to do. Nature's a false construct that allows people to separate themselves from things they're connected to. And the reason for that disconnect is so you can have a hierarchical relationship with it. You cannot abuse something that's a part of you. But if you can convince yourself that you're separate from it and above it and better than it, You can sell it, you can waste it, you can abuse it, or you can ignore it. But you have to create other to create control. We start out by trying to learn from nature that there is a wisdom and a vision that we've lost sight of because we created this false separation. And when we start learning the lessons back, then we start understanding we are nature, and nature is us. I think people are confused. We were all being led to believe that we were going to save nature. What we're talking about is saving ourselves by working with nature. And that's a completely different challenge.
More and more people are moving into urban centers. Having a healthy relationship with nature should be a part of who we are, both individually and collectively.
Now, it's a great pity that in the 20th and the 21st centuries, so much concrete has been plastered over the world. People have moved into great urban centers, and increasingly, generations have lost touch with the natural world. And so public spaces with gardens become vital. Walking through New York recently, I walked through Central Park, and it just struck me as a miracle that we would have a place like Central Park where there would be flower beds and trees and lots of green space.
I grew up in New York City, and my mother would take me to Central Park pretty much every day, which is a beautiful park. It's a 9-mile park. And, you know, we would sit. She would sit and read, and I would, you know, dig up worms and try and bring the worms home.
There's a conscious effort on the part of people to start designing growing things into our urban landscapes. And a perfect example of that is the High Line in New York City. People have figured out a way to design what was once a transportation system into a wonderful contact for humans in the city with living plants and soil. So the High Line is a wonderful example of this adaptation of our cities and our designs in our cities to start bringing plants into the city. It's no longer a concrete jungle. It's becoming a green jungle.
I would point to the High Line in New York City. Mary and I were there, and what we saw was nothing short of a miracle. That is that young people, old people, babies, teenagers, 25-year-old high-powered professionals, everybody across the whole socioeconomic range in New York City was walking in the High Line, looking at each other, smiling, talking, sitting, sunbathing. It's narrow, it's enclosed. Its design is unself-conscious, it's approachable and easy to understand, and you feel that you are sharing something when you walk the High Line.
I walked the High Line, and I enjoyed it. I went to Central Park, I went to Prospect Park. We want to make sure they have that unique experience, because with me, it stayed with me for a lifetime, and I'm sure if we do it right, it will stay with those next generations for a lifetime as well. So to me, memory of place, sense of place, authenticity, all those things are vitally important to what we call really creating that unique experience. We need parks. It makes us feel alive. It gives us that sense of place. It gives us a place where our brains can just relax and take a break and enjoy the natural beauty. So as we urbanize, we constantly hear, if you're going to put more density, you must put more open space. No park could ever be too successful. The High Line, no question, is successful. It is not only a park that provides placemaking, but it also provides space making. You're traveling through space. through buildings, and as I watch people walk down this park and enjoy the beautiful space, whether it's the sculpture or the gardens, it's the views. There are so many places you can take a picture and experience it brand new for the first time that, to me, that's part of the charm. That you have international tourists, you have New Yorkers, you have others just coming there and just enjoying this incredible park. It's transformed the district. It's taken this old abandoned railroad and converted it into one of the world's best parks. So it's absolutely a success, and to me, you cannot be successful enough.
How do we take the small areas in urban and suburban sites that we have to garden now? I mean, I think that is now the front lines of nature. The battle for nature, I think, is less, at least for me, not the Amazon rainforests or the Alaskan wilderness. It's really our backyards, our medians, the DOT right-of-ways. I don't think we think about those areas as being gardens, but they're totally controlled by us. They're totally altered by us. I think the metaphor of gardening is really, really relevant because it implies a stewardship. It implies a sense of care.
Parks Without Borders is a concept that is not just looking at the parks, which covers 14% of the city's footprint, but parks and streets and sidewalks and all the other public spaces, which equates to 40% of the city's public realm. And so Parks Without Borders is taking a fresh look about how we can connect and make these public spaces more seamless. We want to remove some of those barriers so people could get to parks a lot easier and not have fences or gates or walls at certain streets. Start to penetrate it so people have more access to those parks. And so for us, we're very excited about Parks Without Borders to make our streets greener, to bring the park experience out to the sidewalk. And parks should not end at the fence line. It should extend to the street as well.
The High Line is the most visited attraction in New York City now. I mean, by far more than the Statue of Liberty or Empire State Building. That drive is this wild-looking space that floats between the skyscrapers. I think part of the appeal is the evocation of wildness that it provides in such an urban area.
I think that gardens become necessary in the same way that poems are necessary or paintings are necessary, because these are places where experience is shaped and where we can get back in touch with our most private selves and also with our natural selves. We are creatures of nature, but a huge part of our awareness of the environment that we live in is generated by our contact with the natural world.
In New York City, we have 29,000 acres of parkland, but 10,000 acres are natural areas. And we're trying to bring more attention to those natural areas throughout our city, whether it's the wetlands out in various parts, and whether it's in the Bronx. Enough people aren't aware of the natural environment. When we take certain people to these locations or show them pictures, the first thing they'll say is, that's not New York City. When we came out of the post-industrial era, many of the places in New York City, and probably in many of the industrial cities, were untouchable. They were manufacturing. They were near the waterfront. They were brownfield sites, and they were contaminated. And over the past 2 decades, you're seeing these lands restored and healed, where they're cleaned up, and now they're brought back into the city. And we've converted those into these beautiful, incredible green spaces, whether it's Riverside South, Brooklyn Bridge Park. There are numerous parks where we've now taken these contaminated, damaged sites and now create these incredible parks. And I love the phrase healing because that's exactly what we're doing. We're healing the land and we're turning it back into incredible natural resources for the public to enjoy.
I think there will be a renaissance of horticulture in the future, and I think that's going to happen because almost any solution for the city that we're going to have, all these spaces left over in cities, are going to require plants to do it. The American idea of nature is highly romanticized, but the problem with that is that it views nature as something far away from us, not as something that's here. It's nature exists out there in some national park, out there, but here in the city, it's not nature. If the piece of land is not some pristine redwood forest, then to us, it's not nature. And the first step in kind of getting beyond that, the first step in really addressing some of the environmental problems of our cities is to understand that nature's all around us, that our cities are nature.
we have a different generation that understands nature and the environment very differently. When we work with young children, we have a lot of programs where they can help plant trees or plant flowers. It makes them feel very connected with nature, and you can see the glow in their eyes. They're not going to forget that. As we go forward, people are going to appreciate nature even more, and you can even tell from New York City. I mean, there are crowds of people. They love our parks. They come there weekends, nights, wintertime. This is a place where people come just to feel alive. If we want to have a healthy city, if we want to have a healthy natural environment, healthy parks, we've got to maintain our parks, but more importantly, we have to start caring for our parks. To me, caring for our natural resources comes from a different part of the soul. It's not just going through a checklist. As we see more and more development, the natural landscape provides so many benefits to how we're going to grow. We have got to learn how to respect and retain the quality of our natural resources. Otherwise, it's going to take decades to restore it.
We humans are connected to the welfare of the planet because we are products of the welfare of the planet. It is nature that created us. It's nature that we depend on. We cannot exist in isolation of nature. Even though it looks like we can, we go to Manhattan and everybody seems happy. They're happy because they're getting their water from the Catskills. They're getting them food from all over the world. They're not getting what they need to live from Manhattan. Now, the Manhattan Island used to be a wonderful, productive ecosystem way back when. Now it's a series of buildings, millions of people live there, but they can only live there if we keep the rest of the planet healthy. And that's the critical message that we need to get across.
For me, to get to know a small piece of land, and this can be your local park, just to get to know it, to watch it different times of day, to feel a part of it, to feel like you matter in it, is really widening.
We need the garden as a space that will give us a kind of portico, that will give us an entree to nature. And increasingly, as people live, as they now do, in cities, more and more we become increasingly urban human beings. So we live without green space. We live without access to forests, rivers, fields, and streams. And so gardens are going to be increasingly our windows to that world. Gardens are going to become doors that open into the natural world and give people access, even in a city.
There are many ways we can reconnect with nature. Through history, through music, through the arts. Nature is in the way we express ourselves.
We're a historic public garden, and our mission is to preserve and protect what was here in George and Martha Washington's time to the date 1799. What we hope is that people that stroll these gardens and grounds can really set themselves back 250 years ago. We as a horticulture team believe that we want to educate people every day. We want to enlighten them about what's here. And we try to engage them so that they themselves will realize that this is so much more than just this display of history. Realizing that plants are living things, and not just at that moment, but they're living toward the future too. They're always thinking about the next season. It can change someone's life, what they see here. It has a real story to tell. And this garden that we're in now was so special. The landscape he was trying to create was something in his mind beautiful enough and special enough that it would reflect the man that he had become. And so when people came, he needed a pleasure garden because he knew that really fine gardens had pleasure gardens, which were gardens to grow plants not for their use, but for their beauty. But he also knew that the most important part of gardening was still the garden of necessity, which were the fruits, vegetables, and berries. Cultivate the earth for that, but surround them with a border of flowers. You can have both. You can combine beauty with necessity.
Few gardeners failed as often as Thomas Jefferson, or at least wrote about it as unrelentingly as he did. In his garden book, he has a calendar of plantings in his 1,000-foot-long vegetable garden. And some years you see the repetition of the word failed, 15, 19 times down this one column. He once wrote that if he failed 99 times out of 100 in his gardening experiments at Monticello, that one success was worth those 99 failures. He wrote that in gardening, it's the failure of one thing that is repaired by the success of another. A wonderful, beautiful mantra, not just about gardening, but about life itself. But I think that from a very young age, Jefferson was enamored with the natural world, and his interest in gardening and horticulture really arose in so many ways from this wide-eyed appreciation of nature. And gardening for Jefferson was a social activity. Jefferson not only looked at plants as a vehicle for social change, but he also looked at plants as a way of relating to people, in some ways as a vehicle for social intercourse. And even on his most serious letters on the future of the American Republic, we'd often begin the letters by discussing how his gardens were doing at Monticello, or what was blooming outside of Washington. And there's this real union of gardening and sociability throughout Jefferson's gardening career.
People don't write letters much anymore, which is a shame, but it's so much fun to share from your garden. To take a plant and pass it along to someone else, and then they do the same for you. Washington, if there was a gift to give to Washington, the greatest thing you could give him was a plant that he wasn't familiar with. Washington was a farmer. He wrote that nothing, in my opinion, would contribute more to the welfare of these states than the proper management of its lands. And nothing in this state, at least, is least understood. So his mission, along with the other founders, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Adams, they really felt that they were the ones that needed to do the experimentation because they could fail and not be ruined. But from their failures, they learned, of course, as we all do as gardeners, and they would share that with the common farmer so that they could improve their practices as well.
Yeah, Jefferson was first in food and first in wine and first in gardening in a lot of different ways. And he had a myriad of interest in the cultivated landscape. He wrote that the greatest service which can be rendered any country is to add a useful plant to its culture. So he was not only carrying the banner of what we call the organic gardening movement, he didn't have too many alternatives at the time, but he believed in this sort of wholesome balance between wild nature on the one hand and the cultivated garden on the other that I think is kind of remarkable for the time. Well, the word nature was a word that perhaps appears more than any other word in the writings of Thomas Jefferson. There's this kind of common wisdom that Europeans, when they arrived in the New World, were out to conquer nature. But I think Jefferson saw nature as a benign force, believed in its inherent good, both in its chaotic, wild aspects, but also in the unity, the symmetry of nature as well. So again, Jefferson's ideas were always evolving, and it was always difficult to capture him. And Jefferson is all things to all people in so many different ways. He's an ambiguous figure in American history. He's contradictory. And digging a hole to find him in some ways is a hole that you dig forever.
All the gardens here are subtle. I think what you see in this 18th century garden is gardening in its simplest form. And this is a dream come true for me. When they put me on this big old tractor mowing this 12-acre field, I was hooked. It just takes that one little spark. And I feel that Mount Vernon has been that spark, has been that hook for a whole lot of people. I think they come in here and they leave with a whole different outlook in life. They can't believe what they saw, and they come away from here inspired, enlightened, and changed.
Robert Frost defined poetry as a momentary stay against confusion. You could almost define a garden that way. You could say a garden is a momentary stay against confusion. You could say that in the wilderness of life, there are these organized spaces where the human imagination has poured its energy to create light, border, boundary, a certain kind of order among plants, has cultivated it and used it. So it's the same with literature, same with painting, same with dance, same with every art. So art, and gardening is one of the great arts, is about creating human spaces where we inhabit nature and we create a momentary stay against confusion.
I think there is a connection between gardens and music in terms of form. Gardens have form, they have shape, they have texture, they have balance, and in a piece of music, you often find that as well. And it's also, being in a garden, you're on a journey through a landscape. And in music, it's the same way. You're on a path, you're on a journey. It's always been the same gesture. It's always been the same connection that people have to shaping and forming landscape and forming gardens. It's always been a very important piece of human culture.
Art enables us to get in touch with our deepest human sense of self. Art enables us to cultivate sanity. Art puts us in touch with wilderness. And a garden is simply a gesture in the direction of wilderness, but it's saying, look, this has had the human imagination applied to the natural world. And so we're seeing a cultivated, civilized form of nature. Gardens are also places that become habitats for wild living things who want to come and occupy it. But, human beings especially, finally, need to occupy a garden. You've got the gardener who creates the garden, who plans it, who creates the borders, who imagines the selection and the arrangement of the plants, just as the poet is making the arrangement of the words. And then you cultivate this garden, and eventually the garden grows, and with patience and tender care, the thing comes into being. And nevertheless, it's a temporary thing. It can go wild. Very quickly, nature reasserts itself and wants to overwhelm. That's why gardens are a very human activity. It's the human imagination pushing back against nature. But it's not a fight, it's a tug of contrarieties. It's a kind of tussle with nature to say, here's the human place in the natural world.
Was I making it out? Was I taking it down? Will I ever find my way around it? Get my hands in the ground. I'll get my hands in the ground. Will I leave it now the way I found it? May it always be What else would I do with all my time? If you could see the view from here, if you could see the view from here, if you could see the view from here, you'd understand why. Take my place in the line, give my ticket to ride. We're leaving in the early morning light. Get my heart in the clouds, get my heart in the clouds. All this gravity won't pull me down now. And may it always be this way. What else would we do with all our time? If you could see the view from here, if you could see the view from here, if you could see the view from here, you'd understand why. Was I making it up? Was I taking it down?
For the first time, the needs of the garden transcend those of the gardener. We need to start bringing nature home, no matter where home is.
The key here is for everyone to have a relationship, not the right one or the best one or the one that's in fashion. So the key is not which one's right or which one's best. The key is to have one and to get in touch with the nurturing and the growth that it provides.
The ability to express yourself through a garden is a very powerful thing. You know, we're all not painters and we're not writers, but anybody can garden. And that treasure of self-expression, I think, is a deeply moving thing about gardening.
Gardens can be at home, they can be as simple as something in a pot on a deck of a house or, you know, an apartment building, or much more elaborate. All of those are, again, experiencing, actually, we're seeing a resurgence.
People are doing quite interesting innovations in building roof gardens. And you see them all over New York City. These tall buildings will have this gorgeous garden on top. People are finding spaces to make beautiful gardens.
Gardening, to have this lasting, deep power, needs to be in a collaboration with nature.
A garden, to me, is essentially a relationship. In some ways, I think garden design is a little contradictory, paradoxical, because I'm not really sure how you design a relationship. I mean, you can design a place, but really, to me, it's not a garden until that shovel hits the soil. To me, it only really exists when that relationship is there.
We need to work with nature. And as gardeners, that's our role, is working with nature, enhancing it and shaping it and leaving it alone in some cases.
I think that the modern equivalent of free verse in poetry is the new garden, which is less controlled. I think gardens are now trying to negotiate that space between wilderness and the interior world or the urban world. So it's an elaborate series of negotiations between wild and tame, between the darkness of trees and moss and thicket and the urban world where everything is totally artificial. I mean, people live in buildings and houses, and yet they feel cut off from wilderness. And so the new garden, I think, is becoming a kind of liminal space between interior and exterior, between mind and nature.
When we step back into the garden or take a stroll in a park or visit a farm, it's this visceral, personal, and really deep reconnection that was actually never lost. And our brains are so powerful that they oftentimes overcome that, and it feels like something new. It feels like a new discovery. Our bodies were never disconnected. The air we breathe is the oxygen in that air is being provided by all those plants and the sunshine. So we've never been disconnected.
I think that's an important principle that we've lost in gardening. And I think part of our current lack of interest in gardening, especially among younger generations, is that we no longer define gardening as pleasurable. I think we've kind of forgotten that. We have this American Protestant work ethic that really says our yards are work. We must mow our yards all the time. We have to clip our shrubbery within an inch of their lives. But do we really have yards that we love being in?
I think our relationship with the garden is going to change as we learn more about it. In the past, we have viewed plants primarily as either food or decorations. That's not good enough anymore. We need functional plants. And let me just give you an example. In the Mid-Atlantic states, oak trees support 557 species of caterpillars. You might say, well, I don't want any caterpillars in my yard, but actually you do. Each one of those caterpillars is bird food, so that's 557 species of bird food. Now you can compare that to a street tree from China called Zelkova we planted all over the place. It supports 0 caterpillars. So you put Zelkova in your yard, you have no bird food, no birds. You put the oaks in your yard, it's the best tree you can use. When people learn that, they're eager. They say, I want to do that. I want to find the caterpillars. I want to feed the birds.
I think one of the great shifts in horticulture in the next decade is really going to be from thinking about plants as individual objects to thinking about plants in communities. And I think there's a lot of potential when we understand that plants are really social creatures. The traditional horticultural idea is plants as a bunch of individual objects we take and arrange in our gardens. There's so many great lessons to be had from the way plants grow in communities in the wild. And I think it's something perennial gardeners probably understand better than other gardeners is how interesting and complex those relationships are between plants. The potential of plants is going to just bust wide open. There's this perception that perennial gardens are high maintenance. There's a perception that the more complex and the more mixed a planting is, the harder it is and the more human knowledge it takes to maintain that. And I think when you look at plants in the wild, they're incredibly diverse. They're incredibly resilient. They're incredibly low maintenance. And there's no maintenance, in fact.
So how many of the things that we need to happen at home are happening in our lawn? The carbon sequestration, supporting the pollinators, helping the food webs, managing our watersheds, none of them. None of them on the lawn. So I don't suggest we get rid of lawn. I just say we should shrink it a little bit, like at least half, and turn the rest of that land into productive plant communities that help our properties add to local ecosystem function instead of destroying it. That's a brand new way of looking at the land that we own. If people consider these facts to be alarmist, that's because they are alarming. We humans are over the carrying capacity of the planet. That means that in the long run, we cannot sustain the populations we have living the lifestyles that we live. But if we put the plants back that determine what the carrying capacity is, we can actually raise it. We can increase the Earth's ability to support us. Combine beauty with function instead of simply building gardens based on aesthetics. And we can do that. It's all about plant choice. About 80% of the plants we plant in our managed landscapes are ornamentals from someplace else. Let's balance that a little bit. Let's get those high-functioning plants into the landscape.
Beauty is a rightness, a sense of proportion, a rightness that I don't define. I don't make the rules about what's beautiful and what's not beautiful out here. So beauty is an indicator to me. But mostly it's just being out here. And I think this is one important part of gardening is just showing up and being here and watching and not getting impatient with yourself or the plants. You have so little control, really, in the end. So you have to get cozy with that. And I don't think control leads to happiness. So wilderness is a constant reminder of that. It is bigger than us. So we have to negotiate.
The garden to me provides a portal to experience otherness. In this time where we're surrounded with so much technology, our smartphones, which mirror our friends, mirror our social networks, mirror ourselves in so many ways, having an authentic encounter, pulling out of myself to encounter putting my hands in soil, is an encounter with otherness that, to me, is a prayer. I think that the great reminder that gardens are not meant to endure, they're meant to enchant. And when we remember that, gardens are not monuments to our own existence. They're these wonderful, ephemeral places that will only there to give us pleasure while we're alive, and then they will disappear. To me, that is one of the great joys of gardening.
I think for mental health, we need to be in touch with two things: nature, green space, in which we can sort of root ourselves and really find the quiet and the surround that enables us to really think deeply and to commune with nature, which is a kind of commune with the spirit. And I also think that the garden, like the poem, like the painting, like the ballet, is a kind of shaped experience that helps us stay sane. I've always said that poetry is about finding a language adequate to our experience. The same thing could be said for gardening. Gardening is about finding a natural language adequate to our experience.
More fundamentally, they matter for our humanity. To me, the more we urbanize, the more distance we are from nature. To me, the value of the private garden in particular becomes a place of connection for people to evoke the memory of wildness.
Let's think about how we can make choices and what can we gain and what would we lose by those choices. We absolutely have to negotiate. Because of this cultural failure that we have, it's presumed at the outset that we'll be negotiating with nature. We've got some choices to make, and nature's not a bad thing to work with.
Most of us don't have a real close relationship with nature. But when we start moving towards one, then things start to change. Growing up, I often felt like an outsider, that I didn't fit in, often without purpose. It was the garden and my relationship with nature that made me feel that I belong, that I am a part of this whole thing. Maybe it's time to go back to my garden.
Was I making it out? Was I taking it down? Will I ever find my way around it? Get my hands in the ground. I'll get my hands in the ground. Will I leave it now the way I found it?
So So negotiating with nature, my first response is not particularly positive, It really isn't, in the sense that it already suggests that there's sort of an argument or a dispute, some disagreement. Having said that, though, it does say that we need to be deeply engaged, and whomever is at the table, we'll use that metaphor, needs to be listening and talking with and willing to move ahead through some shared problem solving. So with that part, I'm okay.
Okay.
I think negotiating with nature is the essential dialogue of the garden. We are constantly negotiating that one way or the other, and I think it's that dialogue, that conversation. Sometimes it's a pleasant conversation, sometimes it's a frantic conversation. The dialogue changes all the time, but I think, to me, I see that as the essential task of gardening, is to have that ongoing relationship, a negotiation.
We're negotiating it back to our roots. And we need to negotiate, actually, because we've gotten quite far away in a lot of different aspects. We negotiate ourselves back, basically, to where we came from. We want a certain type of community. We want it to live in a certain type of harmony with each other, with nature. And most of us aren't there.
Do you think we negotiate with nature?
I think you do. Do I think that everybody does? No, definitely not. I think we negotiate with our iPhones. No, I don't think. The answer is no.
Will I ever find my way?
I find negotiating precarious. To me, it conveys a sense of, better really think this through and get this right. Negotiating should be a flexible thing, right? It's a win-win thing again. It's you feed me, I'll feed you. But there's something urgent in it. There's something urgent in it. When people sit down to negotiate, it's because they've come to a point, isn't it?
If you could see the view from here, if you could see the view from here, you'd understand.